Most Husker fans know the names Bob Devaney and Tom Osborne, but what about guys like Langdon Frothingham, or the first official Nebraska coach making a whopping $500 salary, or a very first Nebraska game, a Thanksgiving Day victory over the powerhouse, the Omaha YMCA? Nebraska's been playing football since 1890. That's a lot of Husker history and a lot of Husker coaches. In this video, part one of a series where we cover the Husker coaching history, we'll cover the first 51 years of the program. Their achievements, their failures, and their milestones. How these coaches were able to build one of the most traditioned programs in the country. Hi, I'm Ernie Muller, and welcome to Cobsmacked, a channel dedicated to Husker football, the news, the stories, and the history. If you're a fan of Nebraska, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss videos like this. Before we even talk about the first head coach, I wanted to note some differences between what we know today and these early formative years of football. Compared to the high-flying offenses, the elite athletes, and the armor-like pads that we know today, it was almost an entirely different sport at the turn of the century. It started off as a rugby spin-off. It was supposed to use more strategy, but it was extremely unorganized and very dangerous. Players would take an incredible amount of abuse with very little protection. If you look back at pictures and videos, they basically only wore a leather helmet, which did very little to begin with. It was also entirely run-oriented in the early years, as the forward pass wasn't even an option. As a result, players would get trampled in these moving herds of bodies known as the flying wedge formation. 18 players would die in 1905 alone, and some would start to call for the abolishment of the sport completely. President Teddy Roosevelt, whose son played on the Harvard team, would call for reforms that year, and so 62 representatives from different universities would come together and kind of form a baseline rule set. They banned the flying wedge. They created the neutral zone between the offense and defense. They must now make it 10 yards and 3 downs as opposed to the 5 previously, and the forward pass was legalized, although it was a little different than we know it today. If a pass was incomplete, if it fell off the hands of the receiver, it was a 15-yard penalty. If it didn't hit a receiver's hands at all and it hit the ground, it was a fumble. So it was still a very risky maneuver to do in these early days, so it wasn't seen very often. Also in this time period, it wasn't uncommon for coaches to play on the team. They would often be a student themselves anyway, so they would just play on the team as they would, any other player. Sometimes there wouldn't be a coach at all, so these teams would have to fend for themselves and learn how to play the sport themselves. There were also no scholarships, no boosters, no incentives. Really, the only reason you played on these teams was because you were full of pride in what you did. Players would also have to stay in the whole game, offense and defense. There was no leaving the field or you were done. Schedules were also inconsistent, and it wasn't even always college versus college. Sometimes universities would have exhibition games versus high schools. Even the point system differed. In 1890, a touchdown was worth 4 points, the extra point was actually worth 2 points, and the field goal was worth 5. They would change the point system to what we know today by 1912. Even still, this unorganized and brutal sport of football exploded in popularity early on. Professional leagues wouldn't form until 1915, so for that first 25 years, college football was king. College football games could draw in crowds of the tens of thousands, and compare that to Major League Baseball at the time was only bringing in around 3,000. Football in Nebraska was born out of an almost necessity. It was a way that the university thought it could gain respect as a real university and not some frontier college for hicks. Yale, Harvard, and Princeton, all classy institutions, were already playing football at this time, so Nebraska would start as well. Although it seemed made for the average Nebraskan man right off the get, most of these guys were immigrants. They were hardworking, resilient, and rugged. It wasn't seen as a fun thing to do or a playtime. It was a sport. It was a way for them to prove their strength, their toughness, and their grit. Although Nebraska would get off to a rocky start, it would soon rise behind some legendary figures. Langdon Frothingham being one of those legendary figures, although mostly because of his name. He was the first Nebraska coach in 1890, but unofficially, he was not hired nor paid by the university. He got the job simply because he owned a football, and that's pretty freaking awesome. He coached 2 games in the 1890 season at the age of 24 while he was a student. As I mentioned, the coaches typically played because they were typically students as well, and just thinking about a coach at the age of 24 nowadays, it's unheard of. He did coach Nebraska's first game, that Thanksgiving Day victory over the Omaha YMCA, and his second game was against Doane College, and shortly before that game, Frothingham broke his leg while scrimmaging with the team, and so he would return to Massachusetts after the season, leaving Nebraska without a coach. Again, it wasn't uncommon for teams to be without a coach. In fact, these first few years, you only have a coach for like 1 or 2 games here and there. In the 1891 season, 3 of the 4 games we played were against Doane College, which I thought that was kind of crazy too. 75% of your games are against the same team, but during those games, Nebraska had no coach. The 3rd game of the season, however, was against the Iowa Hawkeyes. The more experienced Hawkeyes wanted a competition. They didn't just want to come to town and stomp us, so they sent a coach from Iowa College to help prepare the team. Nebraska credits Theron Lyman with coaching, although he likely didn't even attend the game, and Iowa would go on to win anyway, 22-0. In the middle of the 1892 season, Omaha attorney J.S. Williams began coaching the team. He only coached in 1 game, and it was a win over Missouri, in which the Tigers forfeited because they refused to play on the same field as African-American George Flippin. Flippin was Nebraska's first African-American player and only the 5th in the country. This technically went down as Nebraska's first ever win over a conference opponent, even though that's not how you'd like things to shake out. The state began to support the team really beginning in 1893. This was no longer seen as a team of students that was playing a game. This was seen as a group of Nebraskan men who represented the state and its values. They would go by the name Bug Eaters, and they would take that as a source of pride. During this time, there were stories of Nebraskans who would go through times of poverty and drought, and they would resort to eating bugs in order to survive. And the team really took that as a source of pride, saying that we're willing to do anything, whatever it takes, to push on and succeed. Because of this newfound fan base, Nebraska would hire its first official coach, Frank Crawford. He made a staggering salary of $500, which is just under $16,000 in today's money. I do think it's necessary to point out that the coaches of this time period weren't full-time coaches. So he only got paid $16,000 by today's money, but he also didn't coach the whole season. He would go off to be a lawyer or a doctor or a farmhand, whatever it was he did on the side. He had also previously coached at Michigan and at Wisconsin. Under Crawford, Nebraska would earn its first major victory, a victory against Iowa in near blizzard-like conditions, in which we would win 20-18. Crawford would also play halfback and kick field goals in that game. Nebraska would go on in 1894 to crush Iowa 36-0, claiming its share of its first conference championship. Although he would have success at Nebraska, Crawford held some racially charged ideas that by today's standards are completely unacceptable. Despite George Flippin being a star player for him at Nebraska, Frank was vocal in his criticism of having an African American on the team. After Flippin was voted team captain his senior year by his teammates, Crawford vetoed the vote, ignorantly stating that it takes a man with brains to be a captain, and all there is to Flippin is brute force. Sentiment wasn't uncommon for the era. The statement probably wasn't received negatively as it would be today, but this was less than 30 years after the Civil War. But I did think it was important to recognize the adversity that George Flippin had to overcome to see success, both from the opponents, as Missouri did when they forfeited the game, but even within his own locker room, he had to overcome some pretty negative comments and just negative adversity that he had to face. Flippin would go on to be successful, though. He would be a doctor in Stromsburg, Nebraska, and he would also help establish the first hospital there as well. He would be inducted into the Nebraska Football Hall of Fame in 1974. Frank Crawford would leave after the 1894 season to go coach at Texas. Nebraska would hire assistant Charles Thomas to be Crawford's replacement in 1895. He would take Nebraska to its second straight conference title in his only season at the helm. The only interesting fact I found during his tenure at Nebraska was that we would take our first road trip to Butte, Montana, of all places, and we would go there and we would lose that game, but then on the way back we would beat Denver's Athletic Club on the way home. So I imagine playing 2 games in one road trip, like, completely unfeasible in today's standards, but like that was a fun time for those guys. The travel would have probably taken a couple weeks, and so they had to make the most out of it. In 1896, Nebraska would hire Eddie Robinson. He would post a record of 11-4-1, and he would win another conference championship in 1997 after going 5-1 and unbeaten in the conference. In 1898, Fielding Yost would post a record of 8-3. He was hired with a salary of $1,000. So they've doubled the money now at this point. Football is becoming more of a popular thing. Revenue starting to come in from ticket sales and things like that. The $1,000 is roughly $34,000 by today's standards, and that was only for 10 weeks as work. He was only here for 10 weeks, and then he moved on to Michigan, eventually becoming a legend there. He amassed 6 national titles for the Wolverines. In 1899, Edwin Branch would post a record of 1-7-1, which would be the only losing season Nebraska would have in its first 29 seasons. He would be outscored 154-43, and that .167 win percentage is the lowest in program history. This season would be notable, however, because the Cornhusker name would be established at this time. We ironically used it as an insult against Iowa when we beat them in that 1893 game, but the sports editor for the Nebraska State Journal liked it so much that he started referring to Nebraska as the Cornhuskers. So Charles Cy Sherman is credited with that. I just thought it was ironic that we called Iowa the Cornhuskers, and then that became our entire identity. In the first season as the official Cornhuskers moniker, Nebraska would hire Walter Bummy Booth. By the way, the nicknames that these guys have are pretty incredible. But Booth would quickly turn the program around, rebounding from that 1-7 season the year before to shutting out the first 7 opponents in the 1900 season. That first season, he posted a record of 6-1-1, but during his time, he would rack up a 24-game winning streak, 27 if you include the exhibition games against Lincoln High School. This record would stand for nearly 90 years until it was beaten by the 95 Huskers. This included a year in 1902 where his team went undefeated, untied, and they didn't allow opponents to score a single point. They outscored opponents 186-0 on their way to posting a 10-0 record. Unfortunately, Nebraska was independent at this time, so no conference championships for us. Walter was credited with turning Nebraska into a powerhouse of the Midwest. He would do anything to win. That was kind of his embodiment, was he would do anything to win. They had a small player on the team named Earl Dog Eager, and they would hike the ball and give it to him and then literally pick him up and throw him into the end zone. It wasn't illegal at the time, and anything goes, I guess. So he would do anything to win, and that shows. He holds the second highest win percentage in Husker history. His ending record was 46-8-1 by the time he retired after 6th season. During his 6 seasons here, the Cornhusker fan base would grow exponentially. They started to see success, so the state kind of viewed it as a source of pride for the average Nebraskan, and the attendance at the games grew as a result of that as well. So the ticket sales started to add up, and we started to be a bigger draw for teams to come visit. By the time he retired in 1905, Booth was paid just under $2,000, which is roughly $68,000 by today's standards. That's more than any professor on campus at the time, and the university quickly realized that they were going to have to pay premium prices to keep these, high talent coaches here. In 1906, we would hire Amos Foster away from the University of Cincinnati. He went 6-4 in his sole season at Lincoln, and the fan pressure just wasn't content with a 60% win condition, especially coming off of, Booth's success at the helm. He left to coach for Miami of Ohio, where he saw success during his 2 seasons there, going 13-1. The next coach was in 1907. We hired Walter King Cole. He played for former coach Fielding Yost at Michigan during their legendary run. He coached the last game played on Antelope Field for Nebraska, which was an 85-0 win over Doane College. Antelope Field was replaced by the Nebraska Athletic Field, and we would win the Missouri Valley Conference twice during his time in Nebraska. We would post a record of 25-8-3 over his 4 seasons, and during the 1910 season, the conference adopted a new rule where the coaches were going to have to be full-time at that point going forward. So after 1910, Cole would resign after the season, fearing that he wasn't going to be able to maintain and manage his farm in Missoula. So his final game was a 119-0 win over the Haskell Indians Nations University, which was one of the schools that Jim Thorpe attended. But this 119-0 win still stands as the most points that a Nebraska team has scored. From 1911 to 1915, Nebraska would see a ton of success under new coach Ewald Jumbo Steam. In what you can compare to 1911's version of Bo Pelini, the 25-year-old Steam's outburst and temper were so frequent and fiery that they actually had to establish a women's section far away from the coaching sideline. They didn't want the women to be hearing the things that were coming out of this guy's mouth. Despite this, his tenure would be very successful. He would win the conference championship in each of his 5 seasons while only losing 2 games during that time. His run-heavy teams became known as the Steamrollers. They were bigger and stronger. That was kind of his whole thing. So current day Nebraska fans would really appreciate his style. He would go 34 games without being beaten, not necessarily winning because that would be a crazy record, but they tied games. They never lost any. So he would post a record as a coach of 35-2-3. He would also coach Nebraska's basketball team to 3 conference championships on the side. He developed Nebraska's first 2 All-Americans, halfback Guy Chamberlain and halfback turned tackle Vic Halligan. He finished the last 3 seasons at Nebraska undefeated. He did decline an opportunity to play in the first Rose Bowl. He felt that the last 2 seasons, in 1914 and 1915, that Nebraska had been snubbed, and since they got snubbed in 1915, he turned down an opportunity to play in the Rose Bowl. He was offered $4,500 by Indiana to be their athletic director, which was roughly $125,000 in today's money. He said that he would stay at Nebraska for less. He was asking for $4,200 from Nebraska, and Nebraska refused to give him the raise. So he said goodbye, and we waved goodbye to the highest winning percentage coach in school history. In 1916 and 1917, Edward Doc Stewart would pick right up where steam left off. He would win the school's 7th and 8th consecutive Missouri Valley Conference, both of his seasons. He would leave abruptly in 1917 to aid the war effort in World War I. As we see in the next coach, that World War is going to really impact college football across the board. But in 1918, William Klein would post a record of 2-3-1. With coaches and players being depleted to the war effort, William Klein, who was actually a professor, was brought in as the coach. So the shortened season caused by the war included only 6 games, and after an unsuccessful season, he opted to join the war effort himself. So the fan base doesn't like bad coaches, and apparently it was bad enough that he decided to go put his life on the line. Anyways, I'm sure it was more of a national thing, but that's the way I want to see it. In 1919, Nebraska would hire Missouri's track and field coach Henry Schulte to coach for the Huskers. He was known for his masterful knowledge of the offensive line and his ability to instill that into the players. He did, however, step away after posting an 8-6-3 record over his 2 seasons to focus on track and field, where he coached for 20 years. He earned Nebraska 15 conference titles in track and field, so he was able to contribute to the university, just not really on the football field. In 1921, however, Fred Dawson was able to bring a level of stability to Nebraska on a much more national stage than it had previously known. In his 4 seasons, he only lost 1 conference game, and he established a notable series with Notre Dame. In 1921, Nebraska's only loss was to Notre Dame, and Nebraska would take revenge by beating them in 1922 and 1923. In fact, Nebraska was the only team to defeat Notre Dame while they had the legendary 4 horsemen in the backfield. You'll have to look into them. I kind of went down a rabbit hole looking to what made them so legendary. The 4 horsemen during Notre Dame's time there only lost 2 games, and they were both to Nebraska, so I think that's pretty impressive. Notre Dame rivalry was important to Nebraska at this time, especially trying to ascend to a national stage, because the best competition was on the coast, and like the national champions were on the coast, and that was too far away for Nebraska to travel and play, but Notre Dame was only a day away, so they were a national contender. If we could beat them consistently, then we could prove ourselves to be one of the best in the country. When Nebraska was able to beat Notre Dame's best team with the 4 horsemen, as I mentioned, newspapers around the country started to really acknowledge Nebraska as a powerhouse, and Nebraska was here to stay. College football became immensely popular after World War I, and this was apparent in the 1922 matchup against Notre Dame, which would end up being the last one played at Nebraska Field. The field was built to hold right around 10,000 fans, but the game was attended by nearly 16,000. So it was replaced in 1923 by the first iteration of Memorial Stadium, and it was named after those who died in the war. It came with a price tag of $450,000, which is roughly $7.2 million today. That was an immense amount of money for the time, and it was almost entirely fan-funded. There was some government assistance, but the majority of it came from fans wanting a better stadium for the team. The new capacity was right around 30,000, so there was plenty of room there. I think the most impressive thing was that the ground broke in April and the stadium was finished in October. So in 6 months, they were able to put together a stadium that tripled the size capacity. The new stadium and the crown became a big draw for competitive games. Nebraska would christen the field by shutting out Oklahoma 24-0. The large crowds were unbelievable to many of the visiting teams, and I think a lot of the draw was that Nebraska would split the ticket sales 50-50. So that's roughly $40,000 per team that comes and visits, which is $650,000 in today's money. So that big payday was a real motivator for teams to come to the Midwest where otherwise they wouldn't. And I think that that's a big reason that Nebraska became a destination for college football. In 1925, we hired Ernie Berg to replace Fred Dawson. Despite winning nearly 75% of his games and winning Nebraska's first Big Six title in 1928, Berg was criticized for not being deceptive and using enough strategy. I think, that's some things never change. He was winning 75% of the games, and he was still getting criticized for not doing it the right way, and he resigned as a result. Two coaches with a combined 46-14 record were pushed out by fan expectations, essentially. They were winning games, they weren't winning enough games, and they weren't winning enough big games. So I think that some things never change, and that's just, I thought that was ironic that Nebraska fans have always been rabid. In 1929, we would hire Dana Bible, and we actually tried to hire Nut Rockne away from Notre Dame, but he's like, no thanks. But he did recommend Dana Bible, and so we settled on another future Hall of Famer in Bible. It was notable that we were still reeling from the impact of World War I nearly a decade later, and the Depression hit after the stock market crashed. It devastated the country for the first 4 years of Bible's tenure, and you add on top of that the Dust Bowl, which lasted nearly his entire stay here at Nebraska as well. But despite this, the fan base really gravitated towards football. I expected to see during this time period, with so many people out of work, so many people like starving and hungry and stuff, I thought that the football would become less important. But it seems like at this time that the state and its people really gravitated towards football. They couldn't control the weather, they couldn't control the economy, they couldn't control the government, but they could take pride in a winning team, and that's what Dana Bible gave them. There was stories of lack of quality equipment at this time, some pads that were kind of torn to shreds, jerseys that were torn to shreds. There was guys that would have to go out and find their own shoes, otherwise they couldn't play because, the team didn't have enough shoes to go around. But Dana Bible had a ton of success at Nebraska. The last three coaches had a combined 6 conference titles, and Bible won 6 conference titles in the Big Six his 8 years at Nebraska. He was also the athletic director during his time as head coach from 32 to 36. And his final season, he ranked 15th in the first ever AP poll and would finish the season at 9th. Despite being paid the third highest salary at Nebraska of right around $10,000, which is $200,000 in today's money, he left to go coach at his home state after Texas offered him a ludicrous $15,000. More than the university president and the top professor at Texas combined. He did, however, help Nebraska find its next head coach and his replacement. In 1937, Lawrence Biff Jones would be hired as Nebraska's next head coach. This World War I veteran would take over and win Big Six conference championships in 1937 and again in 1940. He was very military-like in his execution. He kind of embodied the whole all is fair in love and war. There was stories of a game where he put tacks under his players' gloves because they were having a hard time holding onto the ball because it was like raining or something. And it worked. They were able to hold on to the ball, but the opposing quarterback threw a pass and one of the guys tried to bat it down and it just stuck to his hand and he kind of looked at it. And it wasn't illegal at the time. It was probably frowned upon, but he would do whatever it took to win, and that resulted in sending Nebraska to its very first bowl game. It was the 41 Rose Bowl. There was 92,000 fans in attendance, and although Nebraska fought hard and we kept it close, we did lose to Stanford in that game. The guys came home thinking that they were going to, have let down the fan base, but it didn't matter. The state celebrated for 24 hours. They had gone to a huge national stage and shown that they could hang with the big boys. And Bob Devaney would joke that he was in Nebraska for years before he ever found out that Nebraska lost that 41 Rose Bowl. Just people held it as such a prideful moment in the program's history. Another notable thing during Biff Jones' tenure was that in 1939, their game against Kansas State was broadcast in Manhattan, making it only the second ever televised college football game. So we have that to credit. In 1941, though, he had a down year. So the growing tensions of war, coupled with losing 19 seniors from the 40 team, nearly half the team. So the rosters weren't like they are today. The rosters today are like 150 kids, but back then it was 30 to 40 guys because every player played offense and defense, so you didn't need a huge roster. But he still lost 19 seniors in one season. Plus, guys were going, into the draft. People were getting drafted in the war. But he also struggled to recruit high-level talent. He would not recruit talent out of the state. In fact, 39 of the 40 Nebraska guys on the team were born in Nebraska. There was only one guy that moved to Nebraska. So they never recruited out of the state. And some people thought that maybe Jones was a little too ethical, a little too clean-cut, that he wouldn't allow his guys, still at this point in 1940, he wouldn't allow his guys to take scholarships or take booster money. And so that deterred a lot of people from coming to Nebraska. This resulted in Nebraska's first 5-game losing streak in the 41 season. And days after the last game of that 1941 season, Jones was also recalled to serve in the Second World War anyway. Thanks to a long list of men that embodied hard work, grit, and perseverance, Nebraska would grow from a prairie college to a Midwestern powerhouse. And with stadiums packed full of faithful and passionate fans, the Cornhuskers suffered only 3 losing seasons in its first 51 years. However, darker days were ahead, as the next 19 seasons would only produce 2 winning seasons, before the emergence of a Nebraska coaching legend. But we'll get into that in part 2 of Husker History, Coaching Through the Ages. If you enjoyed this part 1 video, please show your support by tapping the like button, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss part 2. Also, let me know below what you found most interesting about Nebraska's formative years. I think mine was the nugget about how the Cornhusker name came to be and the irony that it was with Iowa. If you want to find me, you can find me on Twitter at Aaron Muller EXP, or you can find the show at Cobsmacked Media. But until next time, go Big Red.